Hi, this is lecture 3. Basically, we're going to talk about solid modeling for the course in computer-aided drafting and design, ME 1210. I am Professor Carlos Alvarado. So first of all, we're going to see or talk about what is CAD, computer-aided drafting and design, what is solid modeling, constructed solid geometry versus boundary representation, some exercises, and the available CAD software that could be used to do solid modeling. What is CAD? Computer drafting and design. It could be classified into creating 3D geometry to make solid parts, structures, or that's a combination of parts that do not move one respect to the other, and mechanisms where you have an assembly where some parts move relative to each other. And also it could be used for creating illustrations and communicating information. Now, what is solid modeling? Solid modeling refers to the theory and computation that defines physical objects, or simply it's just a natural representation of a three-dimensional object. And we can see some information like volumetric, surface, and material properties. And it's the best representation to real life. Now, in constructed solid geometry, there are two types of solid modeling: the constructed solid geometry and boundary representation. The one that we're using mostly is the boundary representation. The constructed solid geometry consists of adding, subtracting, or intersecting some solids that are predetermined and are available in the software. For example, in this case, we have a box and a sphere, and the union or addition of the two makes this part. Now, if we have the same box and subtract the sphere, we obtain this other part. And if we intersect a cube and a sphere, we obtain this other part. As an illustration, I have this video where you can see the animation of how this could be used to create solid models. In this case, we have three objects. We have the union, difference, and intersection of the three. And in this exercise or example, you see how these are used to create the different parts. Now, this is another example to make a camera just using constructed solid geometry. This is the lens part of the camera using a union and a subtraction. Okay, then we add a union to create the body of the camera and add more features into that body. And using a combination of these three tools, you can create this solid model. Change the shading and the colors, and you obtain a camera in this case. Now, there are some examples of constructed solid geometry. Here are some of them where you can actually see how the union, subtraction, and intersection can make different geometries. Now, going to the other way of creating solid models, we have boundary representation. And basically, some of the tools that are available are extrude, revolve, sweep, or blend. And basically, we create a 2D sketch and then or a cross-sectional area, and then we perform the operation. Let's see some examples of the boundary representation tool. So, in terms of sweeps, you can create what is called an extrude. The extrude is basically in a 2D drawing. You create a sketch or a profile. Once that profile is created, you assign a height or a depth to that object. And if you do it linearly, or a linear sweep, is called an extrusion. Now, if we take the same 2D profile, and instead of going normal to the plane, we go at an angle, that will be an oblique sweep. Also, we can create what is called a revolve or a circular sweep, where basically you take the same profile and you go around an axis. And finally, you can create what is called, or not finally, we have the blend tool, where you can create a profile and then change the profile at the end, so the part will kind of like be with a tapered angle. And finally, we have the sweep tool, where you have a path, and then the 2D profile follows that path. Also, you could have a helical sweep, or it's kind of like a sweep but going through a helical path, and you can create such a part with the same profile. Now, some examples of boundary representation where you can use extrude, revolve, blend tool, or sweep tool. Helical sweep example, and some other examples to create these kind of parts. Now, this is some exercises. So this first example, you have to decide whether to use constructed solid geometry versus boundary representation. As you can see, it could be created with either of those, but constructed solid geometry, in this example, you have to create a solid cylinder and then use another cylinder to subtract the inner part, and in the top you'll need to add another cylinder and another cylinder to subtract the inner part. In this part, again, you have to decide whether to use constructed solid geometry or boundary representation. For this section, I will rather use the boundary representation using the revolve tool, where you create the cross section of this portion, and then you can do a revolve and create this portion, and then with an extrude you can create these two other parts. And this last part, I will also use boundary representation. You can use constructed solid geometry, but it's going to take you more work. When you create the cross section of this portion and extrude it, and then create the top portions in order to add an additional material for that part. More examples of using constructed solid geometry versus boundary representation, and I suggest that in this case you can create using boundary representation. You can use create this T shape and then extrude it, and then create these two holes with extrude tool. In this case, I will use also constructed solid boundary representation when you create the cross-sectional area and then revolve it around the center of the part, and then you can perform an extrude to cut this other portion. This one could be done with constructed solid geometry. You can create a solid cylinder and then subtract two cylinders. And this also could be done with either constructed solid geometry or boundary representation. You can actually use constructed solid geometry to create the box, and then using boundary representation you can create maybe a revolve of these two parts and create that kind of a profile. And of course, when using boundary representation, is the tool that is mostly used in the software, and in this case I am showing an example of using the sweep tool, the revolve tool, and the extrusion or extrude tool. Another example will be to make this part. This could be made with an extrusion, and then the holes are patterns which can be created with extrusions to cut out the holes. And this part, you can actually create the inner part maybe with a blend tool, and then using a helical sweep you can create the veins of that part. And finally, you can create maybe a part such as this, where you combine either the extrude, revolve, or sweep tools to create more detailed parts. Now, there are different CAD software available to create solid models. The one that we are using is Creo. Is a product from the Parametric Technology Company. In the past, this software was called Pro Engineer, and they changed the name to Creo. That's the new version. The other software that many students tend to use is SolidWorks and CATIA, which is part of SolidWorks. AutoCAD is mostly used for the construction business, and Siemens NX is used for design of turbine components and even submarines. It's greatly used in the heavy industry, and so there are different kind of software that could be used to create solid models.